10 Messerschmitt fighters dominated the skies over Bavaria. An unprecedented steel storm was brewing. A lone Mustang broke through the clouds 3,000 feet below. The rookie pilot had no wingman, no altitude advantage, no escape route. German radio traffic crackled across the airwaves. Confident, coordinated, closing fast. Then something happened that shocked the entire Luftwaffe command. The voices changed, urgency replaced certainty, and one by one the hunters fell away. The rookie disappeared into weather they could not follow, shattering the myth of German invincibility. Luftwaffe controllers desperately wanted to know how a single American pilot had slipped through the most concentrated fighter's screen in southern Germany. March 1945, the air war over the Third Reich had entered its final and most vicious phase. American heavy bombers struck deeper each day, and the Luftwaffe, battered but unbroken, threw everything it had left into interception. Fighter bases ringed Munich, Augsburg and Regensburg. Fuel was rationed, pilots were undertrained. But on days when the weather cleared and the bombers came, the Germans still rose in coordinated swarms. The 8th Air foreknew this, and so did the 15th, pushing north from Italy. Escort doctrine had evolved into a precise science. Layered coverage, sector assignments, radio discipline. P-51 Mustangs flew top cover while P-47 Thunderbolts swept the deck. No one flew alone, no one broke formation without cause. These rules were written in blood, refined through 3 years of trial and catastrophic error. But the rules assumed experience. They assumed pilots who had logged dozens of missions, who carried the weight of combat in their bones. Pilots who could read a sky crowded with contrails and calculate survival odds in seconds. The replacement pipeline no longer guaranteed that. By early 1945, some fighter pilots arrived at their squadrons with less than 300 hours total flight time. They knew how to fly but not how to survive. Lieutenant William Byer arrived at the 357th Fighter Group in mid-February. He was 22 years old. He could recite the Mustang checklist from memory and had practiced air combat maneuvers endlessly in training. But he had never been in actual combat. His squadron, the 363rd, was stationed at a rudimentary base in Italy. The runway was packed dirt, the tents corrugated tin, and the Mediterranean sun baked everything a dull brown. Veterans flew with a weary competence, movements economical, voices calm on the radio, even when the sky turned to hell. They had watched friends die, made mistakes, and survived through a combination of skill and luck. They carried the weight quietly, in the way they checked their guns twice, in the way they studied the weather, in the silence when a new pilot asked a question that revealed how little he knew. The new ones were easier to spot: nervous energy, bravado covering fear, trying too hard to fit in, to be anything but the guy who screwed up and got someone killed. Byer recognized all of this because he was it. The difference was he kept it inside. He spent his off hours studying, after action reports, German tactics, how they used the sun and altitude, how they coordinated attacks, how they hunted stragglers. He memorized the characteristics of enemy aircraft, the tight turn radius of the Bf-1's IRO-9, the roll rate of the FW-190. The Messerschmitt pilots would try to lure you into a climbing fight where the Bf-1's IRO-9 held every advantage. He learned that the Mustang's strengths were speed and energy retention, fight on your terms or not at all. But knowledge was not experience, and experience could not be rushed. On his 5th mission, Byer watched a B-20 for bomber go down. One moment it was flying in formation, the next its wing folded and the aircraft tumbled toward the earth, shedding debris and men. He counted 3 parachutes. The bomber carried a crew of 10. He forced himself to keep scanning the sky. There was nothing he could do. The mission continued. On his 7th mission, he fired his guns in combat for the first time. A Focke-Wulf FW-190 crossed his nose at 1,000 yards, chasing another Mustang. Byer rolled, pulled lead, and squeezed the trigger. The vibration shook his teeth. Tracers are stout and missed. The FW-190 was already gone into the clouds. Byer's hands were shaking. He flexed his fingers, resettled his grip. He was learning, slowly, incrementally. Each mission added a layer of understanding, shaved another fraction off his reaction time. But he knew he was still a rookie. The veterans could feel it, and so could the enemy. Rookies moved differently, scanned differently, flew either too tight or too loose. The Luftwaffe had been hunting American fighters for 3 years. They knew what inexperience looked like, and they knew how to exploit it. By mid-March, Byer had flown 9 missions with no kills and no hits taken. He was alive, still learning, still trying to bridge the gap between training and competence. His squadron leader told him he was doing fine. His flight lead told him to stay sharp. No one said he was ready. He did not need them to. He would find out soon enough. The question was not about courage, it was about mathematics. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe could no longer challenge American air superiority in any sustained or effective way. Fuel shortages kept entire squadrons grounded. Pilot training programs had collapsed into rushed cycles that sent teenagers into combat with barely enough time to find the airfield, let alone fight. The industrial infrastructure that had once produced Messerschmitts and Foch, Wolf-S by the thousands now struggled to deliver dozens. The war was lost, and everyone knew it. But knowing the war was lost and surrendering were not the same thing. The Luftwaffe had been ordered to defend the Reich, to bleed the bombers, to protect what remained of German infrastructure for as long as possible. These orders produced a grim logic: concentrate every fighter that could still fly, mass them at critical choke points, throw them at the American formations in coordinated waves. Trading losses for time, trading pilots for bombers. Make the Americans pay for every mile. It was a desperate strategy, but an effective one on its own terms. On days when the bombers came, the sky over southern Germany could still fill with fighters. Not the hundreds that had once risen to meet the 8th Air Force, but enough. Enough to kill you if you work airless. Enough to overwhelm a single escort flight. Enough to remind the Americans that the Luftwaffe was not yet finished. And on March 18, 1945, the bombers came in force. Over 1,000 heavy bombers headed for targets in southern Germany. The 15th Air Force launched from Italy, the 8th from England, a two-pronged ham aimed at the heart of the remaining German war machine. Byer's squadron was assigned escort duty, a routine mission on paper. The weather was marginal, scattered clouds at 10,000 feet with broken layers above. Byer checked his aircraft 3 times before climbing in. The ground crew chief watched him with a knowing patience. The engine caught on the first turn, settling into a steady rumble that vibrated through the airframe. Byer settled his helmet and checked his mirrors. The squadron took off in pairs, climbing through the scattered clouds toward the rendezvous point where they would meet the bombers. The bombers appeared ahead, a vast silver river flowing northward, their contrails marking the sky like chalk lines on a gray board. Byer took his position on the left flank of the bomber stream, his wingman tucked in tight. The radio crackled with position reports and weather updates. They crossed the Alps under a ceiling of broken clouds, the snow-capped peaks visible through gaps in the overcast, like white teeth in a gray mouth. 40 minutes into the mission, the first calls came over the radio. Bandits ahead, lots of them, coming up fast from the northeast. The Luftwaffe had risen in force, 30-plus fighters, maybe more, climbing hard toward the bomber stream from multiple directions simultaneously. The escort fighters split to meet the threat, some climbing to intercept, others staying close to the bombers. Byer followed his flight lead into the climb. The first engagement was a blur of turning aircraft and blinking tracers. German fighters dove through the formation, fired, and climbed away. Byer spotted a Focke-Wulf closing on a bomber from the rear, its wings winking with muzzle flashes. He banked hard to intercept. The German pilots saw him coming and broke away from the bomber, rolling inverted and diving for the cloud deck below. Byer followed. The dive was steep and fast, the airspeed indicator climbing past 400 miles per hour. The clouds rushed up to meet them. The German pilot leveled off just above the cloud tops and accelerated in level flight. Byer was gaining, but slowly. Then the FW-190 disappeared into a cloud. Byer pulled up, unwilling to follow a more maneuverable enemy into blind flying. He circled for 30 seconds, eyes sweeping the cloud edges. Nothing. The German was gone, swallowed by the weather. Byer checked his position and felt his stomach drop. He was alone. No bombers, no escort, no wingman. Just his Mustang in the vast gray sky. Then he heard the German voices on the radio. Not the confident hunting calls of earlier, but something different, urgent and excited. He looked up and felt his blood freeze. 10 Messerschmitts were above him, echelon ed in a descending spiral, each one turning to attack. The first Messerschmitt peeled off in dove. Byer snapped his Mustang into a hard brake turn, pulling maximum G as the tracers whipped past his canopy. The second fighter was already coming, and the third behind it. They were queuing up like customers at a counter, each one waiting its turn. Byer fought the Mustang through a series of violent maneuvers, breaking into each attack, then reversing to present a changing target. But he could not keep this up forever. Each brake turn bled airspeed, each reversal cost altitude. The Mustang was slowing down, sinking lower. The Messerschmitt pilots knew it too. They could see the Mustang losing energy, and they tightened their spiral, sensing the kill was near. Byer's mind raced through the options his study had prepared him for. Speed, terrain, weather. He needed something that could not follow him through. The clouds. He pointed the Mustang toward the darkest, thickest bank of clouds he could find and pushed the throttle forward. The Mustang hit the clouds at 300 miles per hour, and the world turned white. No horizon, no sky, no ground, just blinding gray in every direction. He held the wings level by instruments alone, fighting the disorientation that made his body scream that he was turning when the gauges said he was straight. Outside, the Messerschmitts milled in confusion. Some followed him into the clouds, most broke away, unwilling to risk instrument flight in a combat zone. Byer flew on instruments for what felt like hours but was probably minutes. He descended carefully, watching the altimeter unwind, searching for a break in the clouds. At 2,000 feet, he broke out of the clouds into clear air. The German countryside stretched below, green fields and dark forests, no fighters in sight. He was not safe yet. He was deep inside Germany, low on fuel and alone. But he was alive, and the Mustang was still flying. He turned south toward Italy, flying low and fast, using the terrain to mask his approach. Every shadow in the sky made his heart jump. The Alps appeared ahead like a wall of whitened gray, their peaks still capped with winter's snow despite the advancing spring. He climbed carefully, threading between peaks, using passes he had studied on maps during his off hours. Knowledge, it turned out, could save your life. He crossed into Italian airspace with the fuel gauge showing less than a quarter tank. The airfield appeared ahead, its runway a thin brown line on the green plain. The landing was rough, the Mustang bouncing twice before settling on the runway. He taxied to the hard stand and shut down the engine. His ground crew chief met him at the aircraft, his face shifting from professional concern to something like awe as Byer told him what had happened. That evening, in the squadron bar, the veterans bought him drinks, not because he had shot down any enemy aircraft, but because he had survived something that should have killed him. One of the veterans, a pilot with 27 missions and a distinguished flying cross, looked at Byer and said simply, "You flew smart." It was the highest compliment a fighter pilot could receive, and Byer accepted it with a nod. He did not feel brave. He did not feel lucky. He felt educated. The war ended less than 2 months later. Byer flew a total of 14 combat missions before the ceasefire, adding 5 more to his tally without incident. He never shot down an enemy aircraft. He never became an ace. He went home with the Air Medal and a story that most people would never believe. Years later, in an interview for a documentary about the air war, an elderly William Byer sat in a comfortable chair and described that day with the clarity of a man who had replayed it 10,000 times. When the interviewer asked him how he survived, Byer paused for a long moment. Then he said, "I read a lot. I studied. And when the time came, I flew into a cloud." The war ended. His total score stood at 2 kills, 1 damaged, and a silent story about the chase over Bavaria. He never talked about that mission, not because it was unimportant, but because in the code of combat pilots, surviving was not something to brag about. What mattered were the men who did not come home. After the war, Byer returned home, went to college, got married, and worked at a manufacturing company for 30 years. He occasionally attended veterans' gatherings, but always sat in the back and rarely spoke. His children knew he had served in the war, but not the details. His grandchildren thought he was just a quiet old man who liked crossword puzzles and baseball. In 1998, a military historian found Byer and asked to interview him. Byer hesitated for a long time before finally agreeing. They talked for 2 hours in his living room. As memories returned, Byer's account grew more detailed. He remembered the clouds, the Messerschmitt, the moment of diving into the overcast, the instant he realized he was alone. He remembered the German radio calls, the contrails above, the narrow canyon he had used to break line of sight. The historian asked if he had been afraid. Byer thought for a moment. "Yes, but not the way you might think. I was too busy to panic. Fear came later, after I landed. In the moment, it was just problem solving, fuel, speed, terrain, heading, one decision after another." The historian asked if he thought his actions had made a difference. Byer shrugged. "I came home. That was the difference. If my debrief helped someone else come home, then yes, I suppose it mattered." They talked for another hour. When the historian thanked him and prepared to leave, Byer stopped him. "There is something I want to say." The historian waited. Byer looked out the window, choosing his words carefully. "People think war is about heroism. It is not. It is about young men trying not to die while doing a job no one should have to do. I was not brave. I was scared and stubborn. I survived because my airplane was good, my training was adequate, and I got lucky. That is all." The historian nodded. "But you adapted. You made decisions under pressure. That counts for something." Byer smiled faintly. "Maybe. But the men who did not come home made decisions too. They were just as smart, just as trained. The difference was inches in seconds. I do not want to be remembered as someone special. I want people to understand that war is random, brutal and wasteful, and that survival is not a validation. It is just survival." The interview ended. The historian included Byer's account in a book published 3 years later, a detailed study of air combat tactics in the final months of the European War. Byer received a copy, read it once, then placed it on a shelf and never opened it again. He died in 2003 at the age of 86. His obituary mentioned his service as a fighter pilot in World War II but gave no details. A small funeral was held. His children spoke about his kindness, his work ethic, his love of crossword puzzles. No one mentioned the mission over Bavaria. But the lessons endured. Training manuals written in the decades after the war incorporated principles refined from debriefs like his: terrain masking, speed management, weather exploitation. Fighter pilots in Korea, Vietnam and beyond learned tactics with roots in the improvised decisions of men like Byer, who faced impossible odds and survived by thinking faster than the enemy could react. The mission itself faded into obscurity, one among thousands flown in the final months of a vast and terrible conflict. No medals were awarded, no dramatic retelling entered popular history. It was too small, too technical, too specific to capture the public imagination. But in the quiet archives of military aviation, in the syllabi of fighter weapons schools, the lesson remained. When everything goes wrong, when you are alone and outnumbered and the odds are impossible, you do not give up, you adapt. You use what you have: speed, terrain, weather, wits. Byer never claimed to have invented anything. He insisted he had simply done what seemed logical at the time. But logic under pressure, clear thinking in chaos, the ability to adapt when doctrine fails, these are not common. They are learned, and they are taught by example. One rookie pilot over Bavaria, outnumbered 10-1, found a way home. In doing so, he proved that survival was not just a matter of firepower or numbers. It was a matter of will, creativity, and the refusal to accept the terms of the fight as given. That lesson did not end with the war. It carried forward, shaping the way fighter pilots understood their craft, their risks, their responsibilities, not as heroes, but as professionals navigating the chaos of combat with whatever tools they had. In the end, that was Byer's legacy. Not fame or glory, but a small, enduring contribution to the art of survival. A reminder that in the worst moments, when the sky is full of enemies and the fuel gauge reads empty, the mind remains the sharpest weapon, and sometimes that is enough. Understanding this history is not only about remembering those pilots who fought for their lives in thrilling air combat, but also about comprehending the power of human will that can burst forth in the darkest moments.